over to Dr. USP.
Thanks a lot for giving me this opportunity. I have the. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. I have the happy privilege of welcoming one of the stalwarts in media and communication research and studies globally. And this particular webinar series owes everything to Professor Graham Murdoch. He's the spirit behind the show. He's the brain behind the show. He's, backed us as ambassadors for the last 4 years of his vice presidentship at the International Association for Media and Communication Research. So thanks a lot, Professor Murdoch, for making this possible. Just a small personal note. We were doing a refresher course at the Center for Culture, CCMG at Jamia Millia Islamia in 2013. And that's where we found a big poster of Professor Murdoch's visit at CCMG Jamia. And we've heard so much about, Professor Murdoch from Bishwi Das sir. And I had the honor of meeting Professor Murdoch at Leicester and many other places later on. So it's some kind of getting together, because Professor Murdoch had visited the center 10 years back. So we are happy that we've got Professor Das and Professor Murdoch back on the on a different platform, virtual albeit. Professor Murdoch is the Emeritus Professor of Culture and Economy at the Department of Social Sciences at Loughborough University. He's held the Bonnier Chair at the University of Stockholm and the Teaching Chair at the Free University of Brussels. And he's been a visiting professor at a number of universities, which include the University of Auckland, University of California at San Diego, University of Mexico City, University of Curtin West in Australia, and University of Bergen. And he's also a visiting fellow at Fudan University in Shanghai. His writings have been translated into 21 languages, and his recent books include, as co-editor, Money Talks, Media Markets Crisis in 2015, Carbon Capitalism and Communication, Confronting Climate Crisis in 2017, a new edition of his book, the influential book, Researching Communications, will be published by Bloomsbury later this year, and we are sure that we would be having him again, when the book is published. Thanks again, Professor Murdoch. Thanks, Professor Das, for making this possible. Now I hand it over to the chair of the session, Professor Bishwajit Das, the founding chair of CCMG Jamia Millia Islamia, New Delhi, and one of our foremost Indian scholars, and who's been a mentor to a lot of people like me. Welcome, Professor Das. You need to unmute yourself, sir.
Okay, now it's
right. You're audible, sir.
Good afternoon, everyone. My sincere thanks to Ujjwal and Uma for conceptualizing this event, mobilizing a galaxy of intellectuals for such a vibrant 5 days program. Especially Uma for your consistent effort being an ambassador of Indian chapter of IAMCR. Also, an incredible pleasure to invite Professor Graham Murdoch, Professor Emeritus, Culture and Economy at the Department of Social Sciences at Loughborough University for today's presentation, titled Digital Ethnography, Researching the Social Life of Digital Technologies. I mean, the title of the talk sounds extremely promising and calls for a new way of engaging with communication research. Especially the subtitle of the talk, by adding the term social life, Professor Murdoch probably intends to revisit the debates on commodities and values. And digital technology is both a commodity and a value. Well, the idea of understanding value has a long trajectory, starting from Marx, George Simmel to Marshall Moss, and Kopytov, and to just name a few. Usually, so you find that this is where Professor Murdoch would like to, I'm sure, that cover almost a long sweep in terms of going from a formal, what you call ethnography, when you talk about anthropology, then looking at digital technology and objects, and also looking at the sense of materiality of the object. And also, I feel, I take it as a privilege, because any formal introduction requires, you know, a note of CV and a list of publications. Allow me to be a little informal in introducing Professor Murdoch, who's not only a scholar of repute and eminence, but also an institution by himself, groomed generations of scholars across the world, and a great teacher. I mean, his contributions are immense on theory and method of communication, a fine scholar who always reads both theory and method as inseparable and allows for further explorations. I mean, his contributions be it on, it reminds me of yesterday's lecture. There was a lot of discussions about concentration and media concentration and so on. I was just remembering Professor Murdoch's political economy article on political economy, which I had the chance of first being exposed to the paper, which was published in Socialist Register almost decades back. And that is how my entry, and being his follower of all his writings. You know, his paper on political economy of mass media, in fact, indeed, it sets a whole paradigmatic shift in our conventional understanding of communication, what you see with the positivist dimensions in the North Atlantic, and his untiring effort to engage with the epistemological foundations of communication as a discipline is phenomenal, especially the need to engage what he aptly calls communication and the constitution of modernity. It reminds me towards the end of the paper, I mean, he posits for the need for moving away from technological determinism and engaging more with how people use such technologies in their everyday life. Probably today's lecture would reflect more upon that. I mean, his contributions are encyclopedic, to name a few, be it on violence, media violence. In fact, he gives an alternative way to engage and understand and read violence and do a scholarship on violence, moving away from agenda setting theory, cultivation analysis, and so on. Also, his articles on communication, past and present, but also very interestingly on religion, engaging with religion or IT and inequality, new media, especially as a gift economy. As a gift economy, again, it's a very interesting way of engaging with new media, I find. And also the lecture was brilliant. In fact, this Grant Sprite memorial lecture where he talked about revisiting public service broadcasting in Canada, that was immense in terms of giving us the hope and strengthening the whole idea of revisiting and strengthening our notions of public service. And also he talked about media and mutuality. I mean, similarly, one of his papers also where he mentioned about, this is, I remember vaguely, which was published probably around 86, 87, that's called Critical Inquiry and Audience Activity. Professor Murdoch highlights the need for an interplay between four key terms that he talks about refers. This talks about structure, culture, agency, and identity. I mean, all these contributions are seminal, foundational, and that really contributes to the knowledge of communication. And I mean, without taking much of your time, I would like to invite Professor Murdoch to deliver his lecture. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and a very welcome to this third session in the series. You may be a little bit confused that I'm entitled Barbara Cairns. I'm going to talk a little bit about technology, but one of the things about technology is that it often goes wrong. And my laptop is not totally reliable at the moment, so I'm using my wife's laptop, which means that we've logged in under her name. But as you can see, I am indeed Professor Murdoch. You may be surprised, and thank you very much to Professor Das for his, I think, overly generous introduction to me. Those of you who know my work best through my writings on political economy may be surprised that I've chosen to talk about ethnography in this session. I trained, part of my original degree was in anthropology, so I've never really lost that. But the important thing to remember is that the study of communications has three major levels. Communication industries and institutions are major organizations in the society with profound relationships to both the political system and the economic system. And a lot of what we do is trying to untangle those relationships. So there's an institutional level. And for that, we draw on resources from sociology, from political science, from history, from economics, and so on. There's a second level, of course, which is that the media are the major places that we go to now to find out about the world, to dream about the world, to see how other people imagine and present the world. It's an enormous cultural formation. And that has again been a major part of the study of communication. How are those representations organized, both in terms of language and imagery? But of course, there's a third level, which is that communications is now integral to our everyday life and is becoming more so. I'm talking to you now in partial lockdown in the city of Leicester in the UK. There are very severe restrictions on socializing, who we can meet, and also on travel. I'm not allowed to travel very far at all at the moment. And that reminds us of how dependent we have become on all those technologies that are enabled by digital innovation. This, of course, has been gathering momentum for some considerable time. The digital age is, in terms of popular use, are probably about 30 years old now. But I think the COVID-19 pandemic has brought home to us how central it is, because we've been forced now to move so much of our life online, including this session here, which is very different from the old style of seminars and conferences that we're used to. Many people are working online, shopping online, socializing online, and so on. So the question of how to use digital technologies in our research is, I think, more pressing than ever before. And that's why I've chosen this topic to give you some ideas about what we can do, but also very importantly, what we cannot do. It's very tempting to feel that everything is now digitalized and that all we need to do is to dip our hand in the great cookie tub of digital resources and we'll find everything we need. That's simply not true. Many archives, for example, are still not digitalized. It costs quite a lot of money. A lot of museums and libraries around the world are doing their best to digitalize their collections, but it's very incomplete. So we need to be a little bit cautious, but I'll come back to those problems at the end. But first of all, I want to talk you through particularly some of the ways that digital technology has opened up research for us before I get down to concentrate particularly on the question of ethnography. Could we have the first slide, please?
Yes, Rono. Yeah.
Here we go.
Full slide. Yeah.
Great.
Yes.
Thanks very much. Well, we can move it on to the next one. And the next one, because, yep. The next one. I'm going to move my hand when we need the slide moved, yes? Very easy. No, backwards. One back, yes. Okay. Just as a context, to say that digital technologies affect and are affecting every stage of the research that we do. This is due to two things. It's first of all due to the fact that digital coding allows us to store every form of human expression in the same format. It's the format of zeros and ones, the binary form. So we now have archives that can collect together not only written documents and statistics, but also still and moving images, recorded sound, and so on. So we have an enormous new opportunity to put things together in a way that wasn't possible before. So documentation, if we're looking for documentary analysis, this has been an enormous boon for people. There is an enormous amount that we can look at that's now in digital form. And because of the increased capacity of computing, it's possible to store much more material than we could before, but also to analyze it much more quickly and much more effectively. Computer power is very much part of this story. So we can do things that we've never been able to do before. But we can also use digital technology, particularly digital connections, to do three of the things that are very central to research: interviewing people, conducting surveys, and conducting ethnography, which I'll come back to. But it's also important to remember that digital technologies allow us to do analysis in a different way. We have new software programs that produce new kinds of combinations and insights. And finally, digital technology allows us to present our material in novel ways, not just as written words on a page, but particularly new kinds of graphic presentation. Let me give you a couple of examples. Next, that's it. This slide shows you the results of a very simple counting exercise that was done by scholars in the United States. Google has an enormous digitalized repository of books published in the English language. Most of them are American, but a number of them are published in England. It's also beginning to diversify the number of languages that it operates in. But this is the original corpus, which was primarily American texts, not only non-fiction, but also fiction, all kinds of texts. And what they did was to pick, and you can do this yourself, pick two words in English: the word to give, which is a signal of generosity, of going outwards, of association with people, and the word to get, which is very much about collecting things for yourself and keeping them for yourself. And you can see the blue line is giving. And you can see for most of the modern period, from 1800, giving was the predominant word that they found. Far more examples of that than getting. But look what happens in around 1970. Getting shoots up. Now that poses a very interesting, it's a very simple statistic, yes? Not very complicated. But it poses a very profound theoretical problem. Why has that happened? Well, I would like to suggest that one of the reasons, and we can come back to this if you're interested, but this is the moment in the late 70s, beginning of the 80s, where you see the marketization of the world. You see the advanced economies led by Britain and the United States deciding to dismantle their public sphere. In Britain, we sold everything off. We sold water, we sold the railways, we sold energy. And that created a huge new market complex that wasn't there before. You see the same thing happening in emerging economies, like South Korea, for example. And you see the collapse of communism in Russia. You see India's turn towards a more orientation to privatization. And you see, after the death of Mao, the reforms in China. So a very concentrated moment in history. You see markets, commodities, selling, advertising, becoming much more prominent than they've ever been before in human history. They have many more platforms. And that coincides later on with the rise of the commercialized internet platforms like Facebook and Google, which make their money by selling information about you to advertisers so they can target you much more effectively. So, not surprisingly, the notion of getting, of having, possessing becomes much more dominant in culture than it was before. And the idea of giving, of associating, of mutuality begins to decline. We can argue about whether my explanation is correct or not, but that's just to give you an example of how a very simple statistic that would have been impossible to generate without digitalization creates a new kind of theoretical provocation. Next slide, please. My recent work has been on the climate emergency. And this is a very simple graph. Again, this would have been impossible to generate without the kind of computing power that we now have access to. What it shows you is the average temperature on the Earth's surface relative to the pre-industrial average, what happened before industrialization in the 1850s. And again, what you see is that it shoots up. Look at that curve. It's almost at 45 degrees, begins to shoot up at exactly the same period that we see this increase in the notion of possession and commodities. So again, this creates an interesting theoretical provocation. Is there a relationship between these two charts? Can we put them together in the same theoretical place? I would argue that we can, because first of all, the rise of digital technologies has been overwhelmingly on a commercial basis, so that it's become a platform, massive platform for advertising. But also the other thing that people often forget is that all the technologies we're using consume enormous amounts of energy, water, and mineral resources. And those are the way that we extract those and the way that we turn them into commodities is having a very profound effect on the climate. So that in using these technologies in their current form, we're contributing quite significantly to what's happening on that chart. Now, I just give you those two examples to suggest that although I'm going to talk much more about ethnography, there are many more opportunities to use digital technology in creative ways in the way we do our research. Not as, I would say, I'm a great fan of Pierre Bourdieu, who I had the honor to meet once. Bourdieu once said that surveys don't tell you anything. What they do is to provoke questions. That survey, we think of research findings as the final thing that we produce. And we say to people, funding bodies, oh, look what we found. 30% of people would like to go back to work. 70% of people want to stay in their house because they're scared of COVID. That's a finding. Bourdieu says, no, well, yes, but it's the beginning, not the end. Why are those 70% of people so scared? What is going on there? And you can't answer that with a survey, which is why we need ethnography. I'll come back to in a minute. One final thing that I want to say about the uses of digital technologies in research. Next slide, please. Ooh. Next slide. Yes. No, back one. No, back two, please.
Don't do multiple at the same time. Just do once and wait.
Yes.
Host.
Okay.
Just
Sorry.
wait.
No. We need the next the one back.
Go back. Do once.
Yeah.
Rono, do once and wait. Not this one.
Okay.
Previous one. Go back.
Okay. Go back one.
Rono, go back.
Yes, that's it. The other thing that we can do because of the massive increase in computer power is new kinds of data visualization. And this is you have to be very careful because pretty pictures can be deceptive. But used well, they provide a very useful way of communicating complicated results. This tells you the density of internet connectivity in the world. Now, I could give you a blizzard of statistics that would be quite difficult to read. This tells you immediately what we need to know, that digital connectivity is very concentrated in the affluent parts of the Northern Hemisphere, in the United States and in Europe, and there are outliers in key urban centers around the world. If you look at the Pacific seaboard of China, you look at the pattern for India, and you see that the large conurbations in Latin America, and you see that ring of countries on the edge of Australia, Sydney, Melbourne, and so on. What you also see are dark spaces. You see sub-Saharan Africa is virtually invisible, virtually unconnected. So is most of the interior of Russia. And so is most of the interior of Latin America. What that tells us, and I'll come back to this because it's very important, and you had some discussion in the first session, we're still living with profound digital divides in the world. About half of the world's population are not connected. And now you can see where they are. They're in the poorest parts of the world. And more than that, the least disconnected people will be the migrants. There'll be people on insecure employment. There'll be people living in shanty towns. There'll be temporary labor and so on. All of these people are invisible on this map. And it's important to remind us of that. And that's a very dramatic and easy way to see what the problem is. Okay, all of that's by introduction, just to say there are many other things we can do with digital technologies, and you can explore them. Okay, can we have the PowerPoints back, please? Oh. Oh. What's happened to the PowerPoints?
Let me check if connectivity, maybe, yeah, it's back.
Okay, that's great.
There is a little connectivity issue from the place where the host is, but nevertheless, we'll make it. Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay, what I'm going to do is to raise one finger when I want to change. My problem is that I speak in a very sort of Latin way. I move my hands around a lot, which is not actually very helpful. So I'm going just to raise one finger every time we need to change the slide. Oh,
Change the slide, not remove it.
Yeah, change the slide. Yeah. Next slide.
that's it. Okay. Well, I'm sure you all know this, but let's get some definitional issues out of the way. What is ethnography? Well, ethnography is participating in other people's daily lives, either overtly, that is, they know that you're a researcher working on a study, or covertly, you don't tell people why you're there. There are ethical problems with that, which we'll come back to in a minute. Secondly, traditionally, this was for an extended period of time. It wasn't like a survey and it wasn't like an interview. Often ethnographies would be 2 or 3 years in duration. You'd stay with the same people for a very long time. And you would try to get as much information about their everyday activities as you could. You would observe them. You would maybe record them either on film or on tape. You'd listen very attentively to what they said, their everyday conversations. But you'd also ask your own questions. You'd hold conversations and you'd ask questions. So that is the traditional idea of what ethnographers do. There are two important things about that. First of all, place. Ethnographies are normally conducted with a stable community or a group in a single location. Traditionally, of course, this would be an indigenous village, but it could be a workplace or it could be a subcultural group. And secondly, time. It's very important that the time period is extended. It's not a quick fix. You have to commit to spending a considerable amount of time with your study group. The traditional origins of ethnography are usually dated to this man, Bronislaw Malinowski. You can see which one is Malinowski. He's the one who's fully dressed like a white settler. And Malinowski's very famous study is called Argonauts of the Western Pacific. And he went to a small group of islands called the Trobriand Islands. And he was fascinated by the fact that they would make enormous sea voyages. The Pacific is an enormously large ocean. And even in island groups, there are very large distances between them. And these islanders would set off and they would take ceremonial gifts to other islands. And they would go round in a circle. And Malinowski was fascinated by this because the gifts had no monetary value. They had no commercial value, but they had incredible symbolic and social value. And they were a way of cementing alliances between the different islands. And it was a classic gift economy. If you received something, you had to give something back. And Malinowski was fascinated by this because it was very, very different from the kind of economy that was emerging in Europe at the time, which was very much a capitalist money economy. So he was fascinated by this other way of counting value. It was a value that wasn't in terms of its economic value, but its symbolic and cultural value. And it became a great classic. And Malinowski is generally credited to being the founding figure in developing ethnography. Next slide, please. Next slide. No, sorry, one back. Well, Malinowski's great insight and why he's still remembered. I mean, there are whole issues about him looking at these societies through an imperial lens and so on. And there's a lot of truth in that. But his great contribution was to insist that anthropologists must get out of their room and go back into what he called the field, that they had to spend time with the people that they wrote about and try to understand them from the inside. You have to remember that up until this point, a lot of what was written about indigenous societies was written by missionaries, it was written by explorers, it was secondhand information and full of prejudices. Malinowski's idea was that if you went down and stayed with these people, you could maybe try to understand their world as they saw it, that you could understand it from the inside, not imposing your views, but trying to understand how they understood the world. Next slide, please. Next slide.
It's going slow. Anyway,
So the other thing that he was important, and we'll come back to this because it's very important. The other thing that he stressed was that ethnography was a holistic enterprise. You might, for example, as he was in his original study, be very interested in a particular aspect of these people's lives, the exchange of these gifts. But he argued that you cannot understand this without putting it in context, so that anthropology is not the study of a specialized activity, it's the study of a whole way of life. And you try to put what you're interested in that context. You try to understand how it fits with everything else that people do. So you're not only interested in his case, the subjects when they were exchanging these gifts, you were interested in them as they lived their lives and trying to understand the connection between the way they saw the world and the way they organized themselves in every other way. So context is extremely important. Next slide, please. The other thing is that ethnography is an interpretive activity. Here's a quote from Malinowski. In the field, one has to face a chaos of facts, some of which are so small they seem insignificant. Others loom so large that they are not scientific facts at all. You see, he was still wedded to a rather traditional idea of science. They are absolutely elusive and can only be fixed by interpretation. Now, this raises two huge issues which are still with us. When you study any life that is not your own, you have to interpret it. And in doing that, you're going to import concepts that the people you're studying may not recognize and may not approve of. You have to make sense of how they make sense. So it's what Anthony Giddens calls a second order activity. You're looking at how they see the world, but you're trying to interpret how they see the world and put it in a theoretical framework. The other thing is that ethnography is not very good at explanation. In fact, many ethnographers refuse to do explanation. They say the role of ethnography is simply to interpret. As we'll see in a minute, a famous quote from Marshall Shalens, that it's what he calls thick description. Yet you're trying to be as truthful to other people's lives as possible and to give them a voice, to show them to people who've never encountered them, and to show their diversity and their complexity. That's what you do. Next slide, please. But there were problems, of course, with early anthropology. It was all done by men because there were major prejudices and academia at that time was even more male-dominated than it is now. Difficult to believe, but it's true. But one of the pioneers of feminist ethnography was Margaret Mead, and again you can see her there with her respondents. She was very interested in childhood and adolescence, and her famous book is called Coming of Age in Samoa. Samoa is again another Pacific island. You might notice that all of these ethnographers really wanted to go somewhere sunny with blue beaches and so on. They didn't spend their time in unpleasant places. But Margaret Mead was fascinated by the fact that at that time, this is in the period between the two wars in America, there was a lot of talk about adolescent storm and stress. Adolescence was a period of revolt and disturbance. And she found in Samoa, among the girls that she studied, this wasn't true at all. Actually, adolescence was a very smooth process. And that connected to a tradition in anthropology, which is called rites de passage, the way people pass from one condition to another, in this case, from childhood to adulthood. And she wrote a very, very best-selling book saying, well, it doesn't have to be all trouble. In other societies, they handle it maybe a lot better than we do. Next slide, please. Then, of course, as societies began to decolonize and began to become quite hostile sometimes to ethnographers coming in from imperial centers and analyzing them, ethnography moved back home. And there are a lot of ethnographies that were done at street level, a very famous tradition in anthropology, but also in sociology. And they began to study small groups of people who self-consciously thought of themselves as a distinctive group, subcultural groups, or in the early studies, gangs. And one of the very famous examples of this is William Foote White's book, Street Corner Society, which is about a group of boys in the city and how they see themselves and how they negotiate the world around them. One of the things this introduced, and we'll come back to this, is the questions of informants. How was White going to get in introduction to these guys? They were totally different from him. So how would they trust him? How would they let him stay around and record their lives? Well, White stresses that in order to do this kind of work, you have to have a sponsor. You have to have somebody who will speak for you. And in this famous study, he found one of the boys who would introduce him and say, look, this guy's okay, don't worry, he's not going to do the dirty on us, you can trust him. Without that, he would not have been able to do the study. He would have been on the outside. So to get in the inside, you often have to have somebody who will speak for you, to open the door for you. Next slide, please. But then you began to see ethnographers beginning to become fascinated by the new media system. And if you've never come across it, this book, Hollywood, The Dream Factor by Hortense Powdermaker. You heard Janet Wasco yesterday talking about research on corporations. Powdermaker was one of the first ethnographies of Hollywood. She tried to understand Hollywood from the inside. There are problems with it, but it was a pioneering book at the time. And since then, a lot of ethnographers have tried to enter media institutions and media worlds to understand them from the inside. Next slide, please. One of the places that they've gone to are newsrooms. Since the mid-1960s, there's been a particular interest in trying to understand particularly television news. This is a time when television exploded in America and across Europe and became the dominant domestic medium very quickly. So for political scientists, there was a fascinating question. How was news changing the way we did politics? What was television doing to the political system? And the center of that system was news, the bulletins that everybody watched every evening. And so you had a whole series of studies, of which these are two, one American by Herb Gans and one British by my old colleague Philip Schlesinger, which were about the news system. And you'll see Philip's title is very symptomatic. They were often called things like assembling the news or making the news, or in Philip's case, putting reality together. The idea was that news wasn't a disinterested, objective capture of the world. It was a cultural product that people actually put it together and they brought to it their professional values, but also they were subject to many pressures from outside, political pressures from politicians and so on. So that it was a zone of conflict. But again, Philip's book illustrates very well the importance of sponsors. BBC News was a notoriously closed system. They were very defensive. They didn't want academics probing into how they worked. They were under great pressure politically as the national broadcaster. They really didn't want independent and possibly critical scrutiny. So how did Philip manage to get himself into the newsroom? Well, his tutor at the London School of Economics was a man called Ernest Gellner, very, very distinguished anthropologist and philosopher and theoretician. And one of his neighbors was a senior executive in the BBC. So he says, look, I have this really nice, bright young student who'd really like to have a look at the news. And he's fine, he's good. Don't worry about him. He's very, very dark. He'll be very quiet. He won't cause any trouble. And he's okay. He's one of us. He went to Oxford. He did PPE at Oxford. You can trust him. And they said, okay, we'll give him a trial. We'll let him in for a couple of weeks and see how it goes. Well, Philip managed to be very quiet and very untroublesome. And he didn't do it continuously, but he was working for 3 years in the BBC newsroom. And that allowed him to produce this thick description of BBC News. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, that was
No, go back.
yes. Okay, yeah, that's fine. Now I want to get to the heart of what I want to say. That was just to say that ethnography in media studies is not a new phenomenon. But because so much of what we now do is online, it's opened up new kinds of communities and new kinds of groups that we can have a look at. But we still have to confront the key moments in the ethnographic process. First of all, how to enter the situation. How do you describe yourself? Are you going to present yourself as a researcher working on a study, or are you going to enter the situation and be part of it? That's a major ethical question. Do you owe your participants the honor of telling them who you are and why you're there? Secondly, as we've seen the role of sponsors and informants, will you need somebody to speak for you before you will be allowed in? And how will you record material? The traditional ways would be field notes, photographs, film, and how would you analyze it? This raises a very important question of what the rights of participants are. Some ethnographers will allow the participants in their study to read what they've written and to comment on it before they publish. But there's also the question of where you publish. Are you simply going to produce an academic monograph, which would circulate in the scholarly community, or are you going to try to make your work more open, to have a website, for example, or to invite people to contribute and comment? These are new questions that, again, digital technology opens up this question of connection and how to use it. Next slide, please. One thing I want to stress is that traditionally, the ethnographer had sole responsibility for collecting material. But again, one of the things that has become much more evident with new technologies is that the participants in the study can also contribute. So we have fascinating examples of video diaries, for example, asking participants to keep video diaries of their lives, to donate their own photographs, and so on. So that the data that you can collect is not only the data that you generate, it's potentially also the data that is generated by your participants. Now, putting that together creates some difficulties. Next slide, please. This is just bringing us back to this crucial point. This is Clifford Geertz's famous description of what anthropology is. It isn't an attempt to produce an explanation of the world. It's an interpretive activity in search of meaning. This is the classic statement of that position. Next slide, please. So the internet has opened up all kinds of new possibilities. It's a space of interaction, but it's also a space for the formation of new kinds of communities, some of which exist only online. And the question is, how can we study those communities? Are they the same as the communities that we're used to studying in ethnography, or do they require a different kind of approach? Next slide, please. So what is digital ethnography? Well, here are a couple of quotes from practitioners. The first is from a man who studied a group who were involved in playing the online game, Battlefield 2. And he went into this as an active participant. He went in as a player himself. The study of online culture can be said to be ethnographic when the researcher becomes a participant observer in the daily behavior of an online community. Second quotation is from Christine Hein, who's been one of the major pioneers of digital ethnography. This is a study of people, fans of a particular TV program. The explanation is ethnographic in that it aspires to understand cultural practices in their own right, accepting that they make sense to the people engaged in them. Now you can see those are not the same thing. These are two proponents of digital ethnography. Strangelove insists on participation and insists on what we might call full immersion. Christine Hein doesn't. She's only interested in how people understand the world, and that for her, you can understand that without doing what we might call the full ethnography, the full fieldwork. Next slide, please. Here's another quotation from her. We learn about the internet by immersing ourselves in it and conducting an ethnography using it, as well as talking with people about it, watching them using and seeing it manifest in other settings. We'll come back to that. Next one, please. So we have a series of choices, some of which raise quite serious ethical problems. First of all, should we tell people what we're doing? Should we go in as an unknown, unobtrusive observer who doesn't have interaction with the participants, who's simply observing, gate crashing, if you like, a situation and not participating? What in internet parlance is called lurkers, people who go into a site but never contribute, never post anything, never but observe what everybody else is doing. Or do we go in as participants? And if we go in as participants, how thoroughly do we participate? Do we participate as a researcher or as a member of the community? Next one, please. So here's a quite useful map that shows us what we can do with virtual ethnography. It opens up a whole range of sites and modes for collecting information, but it also poses some difficulties. Next slide, please. So one tradition is interaction. So this book is a series of essays by people who entered virtual worlds and went in as characters. You probably know that if you enter a virtual world, you can have an avatar. You see, my avatar is Barbara Cairns today, but you can dress up, you can pretend to be whoever you want to be, so you can have intense participation, but you can remain anonymous. Your real identity is concealed. But then the problem is, so is everybody else's. So you have a problem here of knowing what it is you're looking at. The question of performance. So virtual worlds like this are spaces of performance, so people are projecting a particular sense of themselves, a particular image of themselves, perhaps even a fantasy image of themselves. We have no way of knowing actually who we're interacting with. Whereas in a classical ethnography, you can get to know the people. You can probably tell if they're lying. You can see if they keep contradicting themselves. You can gain other kinds of evidence to support or deny the account of something which they've given you. But in these situations, you can't. So I'm very skeptical about the value of doing this, I have to say. So I've nailed my colours to the mast. I don't think this is a particularly interesting or valuable dimension of digital ethnography. Next slide, please. And here's an example of an avatar. They become much more bizarre than this. You can, as in the parlance, you can have many skins. You can pretend, you can change your gender, you can change your age, you can change almost everything. So we have a big problem of knowing who are we interacting with here. Next slide, please. The other problem is that if you go into a virtual community, the only thing you know about that community is when they're logged on in that situation. And you'll remember that Malinowski's argument was that you had to be holistic. You had to see people in all of the ways they interacted and responded to the world. So we have a problem with virtual ethnography, that the locations are very bounded. One way of handling that, which has been developed particularly by Christine Hind, is to try to follow people as they move across the internet. That is, that you look at their interactions in multiple sites, so that instead of looking at a field, a bounded area that is there in time and space, you're looking at networks and you're looking at flows. So that one way to expand virtual ethnography is to go beyond the situation and to try to look at networks and flows, the way people move and connect and disconnect across all the multiple opportunities they have for interacting. That's one possibility. Next slide, please. Next slide. Just to return to this point, but one of the advantages of digital technology is that it's interactive. The classical ethnography was very one-dimensional in a way. It was about people collecting material which they then took away, turned into a product, usually a book, and left everybody that they'd studied simply abandoned. Indeed, probably they wrote in a way that those people would not even want to read the book about them. Well, we're in a different situation now, where participants could be active co-producers of ethnography. They can be active in the material that's presented, their own material, but they can also be active in crafting interpretations. So one second, I think, very interesting dimension is what we can call co-production. That ethnography is no longer only the monopoly of the professional researcher. It's a collaborative project. That understanding how people see the world is something that they can contribute to themselves. And it's dialogic in a way that I think traditional ethnography was not. If you want a very interesting and I think brave example of what happened in traditional ethnographies, it's a wonderful book by Paul Willis. It's a classic book. It's called Learning to Labour. What he did was to study a group of working class boys who were destined to get manual jobs. They had a very fractured school career. They were obviously they had no chance of getting a decent job. And he was interested to know, why were they not bothered? Why did they accept this as something which was more or less inevitable? And he did two things. The front half of the book is a wonderfully vivid evocation of these boys' world. It has lots of fantastic quotations and observations. But at that time, Paul was flirting with Marxism. So at the back of the book, he tries interpretation using a Marxist analysis. Then he does something very brave indeed. He gives it back to the boys to read and asks them what they thought. And one of them says, well, he says, you've got us really right at the beginning, but the rest of it is crap. I couldn't understand a word. Now that presents a problem for collaboration. How far do we go with taking interpretation beyond the worldview of our participants? That's a difficult issue sometimes, particularly difficult if you're studying groups which you are personally not a member of or close to, or who you disagree with profoundly on political or ideological grounds. How would you present fairly the world of dyed-in-the-wool Donald Trump supporters, for example? I would find that very difficult because everything I believe is the opposite of what they believe. But as a researcher, I owe them the respect of taking seriously their views and trying to understand where they come from. So we have difficult negotiations in these situations. Next slide, please. Three problems. First of all, lack of context. Again, to go back to Malinowski's key argument, we're not seeing people online in the fullness of their activities. We're seeing them in particular situations. Now, Christine Hines' solution of looking at networks is one possibility, but you're still only looking at people as they perform online, as they appear in virtual space. You know very little about them as they are in the rest of their lives. So you could argue that one of the dangers is that we move from thick description to thin description. Secondly, the question of the validity of the data that we're collecting. Again, that comes back to this problem of avatars and identity play, that people are performing. If you know the classical work in sociology, you'll know that people perform all the time. Of course they do. Irving Goffman's idea of the front and back stage of life. But something is added online, I think, because people are visible in a way that they weren't before. And so the question of how you perform yourself, how you present yourself, becomes very important. So the question is, who is it that you're looking at? Now, you could solve that problem by saying, well, my field of study is performance, in which case you wouldn't have a problem. You could look at the way people perform themselves, and there's a great deal of activity along those lines. But the other really important thing to bear in mind is what we saw on that illuminated map. Not everybody is connected. And in the UK, for example, we still have about a quarter of the population who have no stable internet connection. They're disproportionately elderly, they're disproportionately poor. So what that means is that virtual ethnography cannot operate with those groups because they are not there on the web. They're disconnected. And their lives, if we move too much of ethnography online, their lives disappear. They become unvoiced, unrepresented. And it looks, there were a lot of optimistic projections for the extension of the internet, but if you look at the recent figures, they've stalled. It looks now as though a substantial number of the world's population will never be online. People in migrant camps, people dispossessed, a very large number of people. So that we'd still need, I would argue, traditional ethnographies that give back those lives, represent those lives in the public domain, even if they are not in the virtual world. Next slide, please. There's also the question of ethics. I'd come back to this because I think it's very important. All research that involves probing into the lives of other people involves us with acute ethical questions. And I'm sure your universities have an ethics subcommittee. When anybody proposes a research, even a student, they have to present their proposal to the ethics subcommittee to make sure that they are behaving in an ethical way. But the question of covert research, where you conceal yourself from those that you're studying, which can be very, very useful, raises ethical problems. So does using material that people generate online without their permission. So we need to think carefully about the texture of our relationship to the people we study. They are not a resource to exploit. They're not something that is there for our career advancement or our pleasure. They are living human beings who deserve respect. And the question of how we conduct research in that spirit is often a very difficult one, but it's one we need to think about very carefully. Next slide, please. So we have a question: is digital ethnography really ethnography? If it doesn't involve the co-presence of researchers and participants, and it cannot access context. That's a big debate in anthropology at the moment, but we'll put it on one side. Next slide, please. One solution that people have come to is to try to combine virtual ethnography with situated ethnography, so that they study the people that they're relating to online also in their everyday lives. That's enormously time-consuming and complex. Next slide, please. One final thing I wanted to raise with you, and this I'm wearing partly my political economy hat. Most ethnographies online are of communities that are involved in some sort of social activity. But behind the web lie these giant corporations that Janet was looking at Disney yesterday. And what we see is the web, control over the web is becoming more and more concentrated. And in fact, COVID has reinforced that. So in the West, we're looking at Facebook, we're looking at Google, we're looking at Amazon, we're looking at Microsoft and Apple, a handful of giant corporations who decide basically what kind of connectivity we will have. The problem with ethnography is that it's extremely difficult to research those corporations from an ethnographic point of view. It would be wonderful if Mark Zuckerberg would allow me to come in and sit in on his meetings, but he won't, because a lot of what is transacted there, they do not wish to be public. But even if we go down a level and look at production sites, we have a problem. And go back to Philip Schlesinger's study of the BBC. He was very lucky to have that point of entry. That's very, very rare. So what kind of production goes on the internet? Well, there are basically three levels, or let's simplify it. There's all the material that people produce on social media themselves. One of the things that's happened during the COVID lockdown here is that TikTok has become an enormous phenomenon. Kids are producing these little videos, some of them very, very funny, very witty little videos, and circulating them online. People are doing that all the time. Then the next level down are what are called modders. These are much more organized, much more professionally skilled. These are groups who modify computer games by adding new material. And finally, there are all the people who are employed professionally to write software, to develop games, and so on. Next slide, please. Here's an example of modders. This is an amazing, a complete add-on to a very well-known war game. What they've done is to create the world of Lord of the Rings, which wasn't in the original game. So they've created a whole new extension of the game. And as you can see, it's very, very well done. There's some very interesting work on modders if you want to look it up. They're generally not doing this for commercial reasons. They're doing it to demonstrate their skill. They're fans. It's a fan community. And those communities have received a great deal of attention in virtual ethnography. And they're very interesting. And there's a lot of interesting work on how modern communities operate and how they collaborate and what they see themselves doing. Final slide. But we come back to this question of the limit of virtual ethnography. One very good recent study is this study by Eugen Bullet. It's called Precarious Game. What he did was to spend 3 years. This is a classical ethnography. He spent 3 years inside a medium-sized US company that is making video games. And he didn't tell them who he was. He actually worked there in different capacities. But he took the opportunity to look inside the corporate system and to try to understand how this corporation worked. What were they doing? What were their motivations? What were their systems of control? And one of the readings that I've recommended is one of his, because it raises a very important thing. What he discovered was that this corporation was highly stratified. So at the top, you had an elite group of game developers who had wonderful lives. They had very, very high salaries. They did something that they very much enjoyed. They had all sorts of benefits. But underneath that was a whole army of casual labor who tested the games. And they were in very miserable working conditions. It was only because he did this corporate study inside the corporation that he was able to develop an analysis of the way this production rests on an enormous sea of invisible, unregulated, casual labor. So that when you look at the games, the people who get credit for them are the game designers. What you don't see and what you would not see online are all that invisible army of temporary workers. And I think this reminds us of the limits of virtual ethnography. We still need to do classical ethnographies, and we need to do them most, first of all, in relationship to those communities which are not online, but also to do them in relationship to the real centers of cultural power, to try to understand how these corporations are reshaping our lives. You cannot do that online because most of what they do is concealed. It's invisible. They do not want you to know what they're doing. Classically, they will only announce something when it's done. They won't invite you as part of the process. So although virtual ethnography is very useful in many ways to understanding the new kinds of communities that are forming online and how they operate, it has, first of all, major problems, I think ethical problems, but it also has major limitations. Okay, I'll leave you with that. Thank you.
Professor Das, you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, unmute. Yeah, unmute, Professor Das.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Professor Murdoch, for such an interesting lecture that also covered a very wide spectrum of work and contributions, stretching from the pioneering work of Malinowski and moving forward to Samoa, to the Margaret Mead, and so on. Before even I would like to open up for further questions. Uma, I'm sure you have all the question banks, right?
There is the question in the chat box. Please see the chat box.
It's there on the chat box, sir.
Already 10, 12 questions are there.
Or do you want me to read them?
Okay. So, no. So before I open it up, I just would like to pose some of the interesting queries as Professor Murdoch talked about. One is, as such, within the whole notions of ethnographies, there's a remarkable shift in terms of what we talk about improvising ethnographies, or what we call interpretative ethnographies, or even embedded ethnographies. So already there is, within media ethnography, there is a tremendous upsurge within the last couple of decades. Besides, along with the cultural return, which has taken up in ethnography itself, along with the writings of Marcus and Fraser, that's called writing culture, or even Prost's race, writing, and difference, we find that there is a continuous attempt to undermine the classicist assumptions of what we call all these anthropological writings, along with the postmodern scholarship. So that is where also a problem which occurred now. How do we engage with ethnography in today, especially for communication researchers, where all our classics are under question? And for instance, like you talk about Malinowski, Redcliffe Brown, and so on, because they say that when, I mean, even these culturalists, the critiques, have gone to an extent of rereading these anthropological texts and sort of try to comment about how they semanticize as they, he, she, as if there is no differences within the community. So it is again a what to call the very question on interpretation, that one interprets for a particular purpose. So that is where another problem which arises today. So these are no more classics, the mere narratives, what we talk about. And also, along with the time, you find that some of the interesting works which is coming up, for instance, like Happy Life, you find there are interesting digital ethnographies on Happy Life. So you find that Happy Life is a purely digital and completely there are interesting that connects with society, culture, structure. So there are different kinds of engagements coming up today and the future for us. Finally, I would like to also bring your comments again to this idea of interaction and interactivity. How do we see the future of communication based on this idea of interaction? Because we move from a social interaction to more and more we talk about digital interactivity. So how do we problematize the term interaction itself? So over to you, Professor Murdoch. Then we can open up for some of these chat questions from the chat box.
Well, as always, you ask the most important questions. I think we're living in a very a pivotal moment at this present time in terms of the study of communication. We're living in a commercially saturated communications environment around the world. Even in China, where I spent a lot of time, you'll see wall-to-wall advertising on all the channels. This is something which we've never seen in world history before. And I think if we go back, if you look at the modern world, when we started, let's say 1800, people were offered three identities, what we might call three master identities, which connected them to social life beyond their village and beyond themselves. They were given the notion of worker, that one of your identities was to be a worker. Secondly, and this was the site of enormous struggle for decades, to be a citizen, to be an active participant in the political systems that govern your life. And thirdly, to be a consumer. What I think we see in the modern world, and I've written about this at length, is the eclipse of the citizen and the rise of the consumer. So that, to go back to that very simple graph that I showed you of giving and getting, I think that's partly what's going on. That you see that what's happened in the US in COVID. You see the state legislature in Minnesota the other month was surrounded by armed militia who were demanding that they weren't to be locked down because they had the sovereign individual right to do whatever they wanted. Never mind that what they wanted to do would spread infection to other people. They had that right. Now, I think that idea of individual entitlement is becoming more and more dominant, and it's beginning to eclipse the idea that we are also members of moral and social communities to which we owe a responsibility. We owe a responsibility to the collective good, not to do things that are going to make life worse for other people. I think that idea of mutuality is disappearing. So I think we're at a very critical moment in history at the moment, that what we might call the first modern age, which had those three identities at its center. I think we're at the tipping point now, and we have to think very carefully about how we imagine ourselves in relationship to other people, and how we imagine our rights in relationship to other people's. And for me, that's really the crucial question. And it's one of the reasons I'm now so interested in climate change, because climate change is a global and it's a collective disaster. So the question of how we tackle it requires us to reimagine our collective responsibilities. But that's very difficult, I think, in the current sort of ideological context. So I'm not pessimistic, but I think we have a big struggle to find a way of imagining ourselves together, which is not consumerized, and is not dominated by a narrow nationalism. That our notion of being on the planet in the same space has to be reimagined in a different way.
Okay.
So
we have,
for me, that's the big question that we're facing right now. And that relates to the question of interaction. It's a question of what kind of interaction we have with each other, on what terms, and who controls it. That's why it's so important.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions, so let me quickly sort of try to go through these questions.
Actually, there are quite a few questions,
Okay.
and because it is important that we address the question of the 180 people listening to it patiently. So
Okay.
I would request Professor to briefly answer, but try answering as much as possible. Yes,
So
sir.
let me go quickly to the first one. Where is it? Can I go to the first one?
You
somewhere?
want us to read out? You want
Yeah,
you or me to
not-
read out?
I mean, can I see the first one, please?
It is all there in the chat box. If you can't, no
Okay.
problem, sir. Let's not waste time.
Okay, okay, please,
US
please.
Yeah. The question that I see in front of me from Subhrajit Datta, can you please explain big data give and take on slide 4 and rising global temperature on slide 5 and how these are connected to the central question of digital ethnography? Big data give and take and rising global temperature.
How are they connected?
Yes, to digital ethnography.
Well, that would take us rather a long time, but
Yeah.
they're connected. What I would like to say is when you think about communications, the study of communications has primarily been a study of the way that organizations organize our imaginative world and how we interact with those resources, yes? So we have the study of institutions, texts, and audiences. What we've missed, I think, in that is the study of infrastructures and machines. So that everything we do, what we're doing now, requires us all to have a machine in front of us. That machine is made of metal, it's made of glass, it's powered by electricity. We're using a global network which consumes enormous amounts of power. And so what I've been arguing recently is that the study of communication has to add the material basis of communication into its analysis. And once we do that, we see that the way that we choose to operate online has real environmental consequences. The more data we transact, for example, the more energy is used. So the more we move down the road towards a digital saturated environment, the more damage we're likely to do to the environment. So the question is, can we think of a way of reorganizing not only communications as a system of interaction, but as a material system? Can we think of making things out of different substances that would be biodegradable, for example? Do we need to have lithium batteries? Can we think of batteries in a different way? Should we invest massively in solar and wind power to have clean energy? We have not really contributed very much to these debates as scholars of communication. But I would argue that we should, precisely because we're moving so much of what we do online. So as scholars of communication, it's our responsibility not to be silent about the environmental consequences of that.
Great.
That's why I put those two graphs in the same place.
Thank you. There is another from Anupam Devnath. How do you see ethnography changing with the coming of post-humanism? Post-humanism impact on ethnography?
Well, it's very interesting, isn't it? Some people argue that traditional ethnography is impossible and will remain impossible because it requires you to have intimate and close encounters with people. It requires you to travel. Both of those things are not at the moment possible. So the question is, and nobody knows the answer to this, is this current pandemic an event that it will eventually come to an end? Or is it a process Is it something that we will always be living with? And will it flare up periodically in ways that we can't at the moment predict? If that second scenario is correct, then that means traditional ethnography will become impossible, because you will not be able to relate to people in the way that the traditional tenets of ethnography require. So we may see the death, if you like, of traditional ethnography, which is one of the reasons why we need to think about the strengths and limits of doing ethnography in other ways.
Great. Akanksha Shukla is asking, when sponsored research in social science is extremely rare in developing economies, the internet itself reports non-response on emailed questionnaires. How do you see ethnography staying alive, except while doing a PhD? Neither is it possible due to role of the teacher in the teaching jobs in India. And while doing, except in PhD, how can it be made alive?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand the question. Could you rephrase it for me?
We can go ahead. We can go ahead. Samir Patankar is asking how to eliminate personal and subjective bias while conducting ethnographic research in cross-cultural communication.
Well, I think that's a problem with any kind of research, actually, because all research involves choices. Even if you're doing documentary research, you're choosing to look at some things and not at others. You're choosing to interpret them through a particular framework of inquiry. So you have to make choices. I don't think it's possible to be objective in the way that it was traditionally thought of. I think a better strategy is to be honest about where you're coming from and to say, look, this is one account. Here's the evidence that I've collected. Here's the way that I make sense of it.
I think
Great.
there is an.
What do you think? I mean, there are always multiple interpretations of the same thing.
Right.
And this is why social science is not like physics.
Right.
Yes?
Yeah.
You know, there is no equivalent of gravity in social science because we're dealing with human behavior. We're dealing with societies.
Absolutely.
We're dealing with imagination. We're dealing with cognition. So all of these things are slippery. They're always going to be slippery. So I think the search for something that is objective is impossible. What is always, I think, a better way to think about it is, first of all, try to collect the most comprehensive range of evidence that you can find. Right. Don't leave anything out. And then judge an interpretation in terms of how well it accounts for that evidence.
We have a question, Dr. Saurabh Gupta, that is, should we study the materiality of medium as in media aesthetics under digital ethnography?
Sorry, can you say again? I'm having a little problem with my sound.
Should we study the materiality of medium as in media aesthetics under digital ethnography? Can you hear me?
Well, I think it raises a bigger question for me.
Yes.
Always, I'm afraid. The question is, what are the boundaries of the study of media? This is not an easy question to answer. Traditionally, we said, well, we study media. But because media intersects with everything else, do we have to follow those connections where they take us? Right. That's a really big question. And one of the answers to that, I think, is that we need to develop more interdisciplinary research. I've always worked in contexts which have contained people with multiple disciplines. although I have a particular training which leads me to ask questions in a particular way, I have enormous respect for people who've been trained in another way with different questions. And my great advantage has been to work with people who ask questions I would never have thought of, that challenge me. And so I think part of the big question that we have is the way universities are organized. We're organized in departments. We're organized in feudal empires, or all of which are competing for resources and staff and so on. That makes sense institutionally, but it doesn't make sense intellectually, because so many of the things that we need to investigate require us to bring together expertise from many different places. Including, I think now, the traditional sciences. So I think I need to talk to people who are experts in minerals, experts in mining, experts in agriculture, because I can see connections between what I'm interested in and their expertise. So I think again, you can't deconstruct the university, but I think one of the things that we need to look for is to try to create more institutes that are genuinely interdisciplinary and that are containing multiple perspectives, because I think that's the only way we're really going to get a handle on the complexity of what's going on now. We can't do it individually. However skilled we are as practitioners in our particular specialism, we need other people, and we need them more than ever. So I think I would recommend, if you have any spare money in your university, to lobby for a research institute that is genuinely interdisciplinary.
Great. Thank you, sir. SR Sanjeev from Kerala is asking, when there are conscious and purposeful attempts to camouflage offline identity in online realms, and when there are powerful self-interests in play over real selfhood, is it possible to have a holistic understanding of the cohort through the methodological frame of digital ethnography? I mean, offline, online, you have raised the question earlier. So
yes. Well, I think it would depend on your framework. So if you took a classical phenomenological perspective, for example, you would want to say that people are, whenever people are in the presence of at least one other person, they're performing, they're projecting themselves, they're making an impression, they're wanting you to think of them in a particular way. We do that in all sorts of ways, all the time. So what we do online is a continuum, if you like, of what we do in everyday life. So we could, in principle, try to understand all the ways people project themselves, but their performances would vary depending on the audience that they were projecting to. So your performance with close friends would be very different from your performance with people you knew only very slightly. So I think we could begin to try to put those things together if you were interested in that sort of Goffman-esque idea that everybody's life has what he calls a backstage and a front stage. The stage is when you go through the curtains and perform, and the backstage is when you're off duty, so to speak. And there's an enormous volume of research trying to understand how people negotiate, moving between those two dimensions of their social life, and that's possible, very interesting, and I think that will be something we will see more of as people spend more and more time online.
Thank you. There's one good question from Arka Prabha. I think this might be the last one because we are already 15 minutes beyond time. And
okay.
I would look for concluding comments from our chair as well. So Arka Prabha Chattopadhyay is asking, to study folk media forms such as dance, theater, etc., apart from conventional ethnographic methods, is it recommended to study them as a performance text and thus adopt a multi-methodology approach like ethnosemiotics?
Well, there is of course in classical anthropology, performances were very much part of the social life of the people being studied. Dances, rituals, particularly, there's a very rich anthropological tradition of rituals, religious practices, for example, which were one of my long-standing interests. So if you think of religious communities are an ensemble of beliefs. They're an ensemble of practices people are required to do at particular moments. But they're also communities of support and mutuality. So again, to go back to Malinowski, yes, we could look at the performance. If you take, for example, the Catholic Church has these saints' days, and they're very often the occasion for a huge performance, a carnival. Maybe an effigy will be paraded through the streets and so on, and there'll be special songs and so on. That's very interesting to look at, and they're fascinating and dramatic, but they can only really be understood in terms of a wider understanding of that community, of all the other ways in which they reinforce their solidarity and their faith. So if you're interested, I would advise you to look at the anthropology of religion, because that's probably the place where these issues have been most analyzed in detail.
Great, thank you. There are two foreign scholars who have joined, very well-known scholars. It would be important for us to actually take up their questions. I know the time is up still. Juven Naino Villacastin from Philippines. And his question is, given that ethnography takes a substantial amount of time for data gathering alone, how do you know if you have gathered enough data for analysis? In connection to this, can we gather a sufficient amount of data for analysis even in short amounts of time, like say for weeks or months, within weeks or months?
Well, that's a very good question. It's a conceptual question, but it's also a practical question, because most people's field work is limited by circumstances beyond their control. For example, most of it, if you're an academic, it's mostly done on vacation or study leave, and those have finite endpoints. So basically, your choice is made for you. Also, if this is again with my political economy hat, if you're in receipt of a grant, there's usually a date by which you have to submit a report. So even if you feel you've only just scratched the surface, you're obliged to wrap it up in some way, whether you feel that is adequate or not. So there's no answer to that. I mean, some anthropologists have actually gone back again and again to the people that they first studied, and those are very, very interesting. And that opens up a whole other kind of anthropology, which is an anthropology of change. How people adapt to changes in their life, but also changes in the social environment in which they find themselves. So one fascinating area would be migration. What happens when people migrate from the village to the city? Do you follow them into the city? That would be wonderful. So I'm afraid there's no answer, no good answer to that.
There has been a big reverse migration in India also in recent times. Anyway,
yes, of course.
The last question we take up, I know it's too much beyond time. Dr. Madhav Chandra Das from Bangladesh, a professor of media from Bangladesh, asking, do you think going for digital ethnography right now is a little bit of risky, compromising the researcher's topic's health? Topic means subject's health.
Well, yes, there are but there are risks with doing any kind of research. I think the two questions we have to ask ourselves are, now that so much of our life has moved online, how do we study life online is the big question. And I think that COVID-19 has dramatized that. People are spending vastly more time online than they've ever done before, because where I am, they're locked in their houses. So the cinemas are all closed, the cafes are all closed. So of course they're moving online. And there's some sense that that will probably continue. For example, there are fascinating speculations about whether people will go back to work. A lot of people have discovered that they actually like working at home. So living online is going to be a very rich area, not just about leisure, as it was maybe before, but possibly about everything. So we do need to take it very seriously, and we need to engage with it in order to have a map of the contemporary world. But how far ethnographic studies will take us is a question we need to ask. I think we need to approach life online from multiple directions. And I don't think ethnography will solve all of our problems.
That would be a great subject of research going ahead, particularly in a developing society like India. Sir, Biswajit, if you could please summarize and conclude the whole thing.
Okay, I'm sure all of you will agree with me. It was such a wonderful session with all kinds of exciting intersections and also replies by Professor Murdoch. Started with the idea of anthropology and the field and moved away from the field setting. It can be extended, and probably media gave a new meaning to the whole notions of ethnographies, because along with the production, along with the organizations where such ethnographies were held and conducted, for instance, like Putting Reality Together by Philip Schlesinger. It reminds me when the second edition came out, and where he sort of wrote about how people are suspicious within BBC in the Bush House itself, and sort of trying to comment that somebody is sort of trying to comment on their nature and practice of work within the organizations. And even though Philip Schlesinger was inside BBC Bush House and listening and sort of trying to comment on it, that was an excellent work by probably studying any organization, media organizations, and ethnographies within organizations. And from there, we moved studying organizations. Now we moved to the virtual. It also reminds me interesting work coming away from the field itself, what you rightly mentioned about stable, the community, and ethnographies confined to the communities. Now we moved ahead. In fact, it reminds me of Sean Moore's work, where he talks about taxi drivers and sort of trying to navigating in the city, spending a lot of time and driving itself in the city. And that's an interesting ethnography, is what Sean Moore's does on, studying on, not on community or the field, but it can be anywhere. So the very idea of ethnography is extended, not from, no more confined to the field. It can be anywhere studied, or what, as you rightly pointed out, it's about interpretation, not about explanations. And also this is where I think what finally you mentioned about the notion of performance and performance is another, probably an area which is less studied within communications. But recently, you know, that like scholars like Judith Butler and so many others have been writing that how, public sphere itself is performative. Public sphere itself is performative. No more in a Habermasian notions of reason and rational debates. Today, probably populism has taken over. So it is all performative. So populism and performance everywhere. Whether it is in the global north or global south, everywhere you find. So performance or performativity or performative communication is another area which needs to be taken seriously in communication. Thank you very much. And we would like to have you very often. Now I
Yes.
realize, and more lectures. So that will create again a kind of a larger understanding and also grounding in communications in India. I thank you very much for the lecture, as well as I thank all the audience and my colleagues, even Ujjwal and Uma, for organizing such a brilliant lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Das. It was very, succinct comment. And we all echo your feeling, your spirit that we need him more and more and on more contemporary issues as well. Whichever institute invites, we, the entire academic community of media in India, would love to listen. Just the way people are listening, almost 190 people at the best was there. And there were at least, if not more, 22 plus foreigners from multiple countries. If one sentence I will remember, Dr. Murdoch, three master identities: worker, citizen, and consumer. Eclipse of the citizen, rise of the consumer. This is something that I will take very strongly with me. Responsibility to the collective good is disappearing. This is something that stands out. I mean, you have gone deep into the subject, but as a person of communication and as a citizen as well, this is something I take very strongly, particularly at a time when democratic institutions around the world and citizens' participation in democracy is actually on the wane, on the decline. Right. And it has become just a representative democracy and not so much participative democracy. I also appreciate, sir, that you started by noting the chaos of facts and how analysis through interpretation is required. A disciplined approach is required to make a sense of facts, because there is a chaos of facts otherwise. You also mentioned feminist ethnography of Margaret Mead. That was a great timely point of view that you brought in. No critical scrutiny, no independent approach, even by established media houses like BBC, you explained, and how it can be broken. Ethnographic process, the process you explained so well, with self-presentation, representation by others, writing and publishing, recording data and photos, open-ended interviews, life histories, diaries, and all that. That was a great explanation over 3 or 4 slides that you could bring, that can be a subject of 2 or 3 full lectures. Online researcher, coming to the online researcher, you spoke about participant observer in the online community. That's one type. So participant observer, and the other one, cultural practices of an online group as expressed virtually. So researcher can be an obtrusive observer or an active participant. Both sides, and obviously the role of both the types of researcher are very different. I also like the entire talk on avatar. Avatar, we call avatar here, but anyways, avatar, virtual worlds, yet anonymous. But all being anonymous is a problematic, as you rightly said, because that could be a fantasy image. And therefore, we cannot know well, the identity play is not clear. And there are ethics of concealment that you explain so well. Ethnographic challenges from 1 to multiple sites, that's another challenge. So it's not just one setting, online setting, but multiple sites and multiple setting that people are into. You have also talked about how research subjects can be the collaborators and the co-production or participators of the research itself. Subject itself as a participator, great. You then, after building the entire case of virtual ethnography, I'm amazed, you also demolished the limitations. You also demolished by noting the limitations of virtual ethnography. Thick description, moving to thin description online. Problems of identity, avatar. Digital divide, very big reality. 78% of Indian student community are not truly on digital platform just now. Only 28% are. So that's a big reality. Ethics of concealed research, researchers' surveillance, using online material without permission of the persons whose material we are using, responsibilities towards the electronic community. So these are certain limitations that you have brought forth, and you have raised the question that digital ethnography, or in another word, netnography, is it really very ethical or very right? And there you have suggested the use of blended ethnography, bringing forth both virtual and offline or contextual ethnography. And finally, I really enjoyed the talk on how 3 original media materials can be there, or you can identify 3 original media materials. Social media by amateurs like amateurish TikTok or Facebook post and whatever, or modders, those who modify the computer games with new material. And thirdly, original production by the employed professionals. These 3 categories. These leading to the conclusion finally that interdisciplinarity focus is right for a university, for an academic institute, because we are in a complex reality of today. And you also suggested how research can further grow into the field of ethnography, more particularly virtual ethnography and its limitations. Thank you, sir, for a fabulous session. We'll remember this talk for more than an hour, and the entire exposition and the study materials that you shared also. Before we close, I remind everyone, tomorrow at 3 p.m., same time today, like today, we have another illustrious colleague of Dr. Murdoch, Professor Thomas Tofte, Professor, Loughborough University, UK, collaborated with World Bank, UNICEF, UNESCO, and USAID. He would be speaking on mobile phones in everyday life and the communication challenges therein. And he would take up case studies, I think from Africa. He would take up case studies and would be speaking on that. We meet, same link to join as of today. For those who are asking the PowerPoint presentation of every speech, please go back. I am once again repeating Adamas University Facebook page, Adamas University YouTube link, the Policy Times Facebook page, the Policy Times YouTube link, and indiareal.in, YouTube and Facebook. All these 6 platforms have actually has already telecast video stream this session, and you will get all the PowerPoints there. For as far as the 3 study materials that was sent by Dr. Murdoch, it has been shared in every group. Wherever you have got the information of this particular program, it has been already shared in every group. Yes, Devinaji is already putting the YouTube link in the chat box. That gives the entire presentation. And all the study materials have been shared by USP diligently. He did it diligently. He wasn't so well, but in spite of that, till midnight, he shared it on all groups. And also, I have also shared. So anyone can WhatsApp me or USP and get that if you haven't got. With that, we bring this fabulous session to an end. 2-hour session, fabulous. Salute, Dr. Murdoch, and thank you, Bishwajit, our own Bishwajit.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Murdoch, from the Indian International Association for Media and Communication Research. We are proud to have you amongst us, and as promised, we'll be having you again for another session at another series, very soon. Thank you, everybody.
Okay. I just wanted to.
Thank you, USP.
Now, Professor is saying something.
Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to say one thing. I noticed a lot of people have been asking questions on the chat box. You'll send me an email, and I'll try to answer them by email.
We'll take the questions and we'll put it to you, and then we'll pass it on to them. Thank you very much, Professor.
Okay, good.
Thank you.
So we meet tomorrow, same time, same place.
I will write a mail. Okay. Thank you.
Mobile phones in everyday life, the case of young Kenyan men, tomorrow, same time, same place.